Welcome to Merit TV Canada's Election Watch as we move towards the polls on April 28th. My name is David Craig. Thank you for joining us this evening, being Thursday. We want to get a lot of information to you over the last 24 hours as things are continually evolving before the big voting day on Monday, April 28th. If you have not voted, if you did not take part in the advanced polling this past weekend, which, by the way, had a record turnout, over 7.2 million people went out to vote, which is a 25% increase from the last election, which is good job, Canada. Happy to see people going out and voting. But if you have not yet voted, make sure you're making time for this upcoming Monday. In the past 24 hours, both Prime Minister Mark Carney as well as Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, they've intensified their campaigns. Pierre Poilievre will be joining and becoming in Calgary for a campaign here to advocate throughout Alberta on Friday evening. There's a number of things that they continue to bolster and to double down on. Mark Carney is continuing to emphasize the sovereignty but also economic independence. He is centering his campaign on defending Canada's sovereignty in light of Donald Trump and the United States remarks about Canada becoming a 51st state, which, as you know, the Liberals are hinging a lot on this. They are bolstering up the threat from the South, making that U.S. is the biggest economic threat to Canada, talking about how he is the leader, the one that can save and protect Canada from this type of thing. And one of his strategies is to do reciprocal tariffs, which he is doubling down on, which currently accounts for the trade between us and them. About 75% of Canadian exports goes towards them. So that is something that they are making a big part of their platform. It is something that you and I have to look at. Is the U.S. actually a giant threat to us? My personal opinion, if you want David's personal opinion, I think it is a distraction. The U.S. is not our biggest problem. Trade talks and tariff wars, we do not want to get into a tariff war. And there is a way that we can handle it with the United States in the economic position that we are in that does not hurt Canadians. Because remember, the Liberals specifically bought ads in the United States stating that the U.S. is adding tariffs on Canada. It is hurting Americans. But right now, the Liberal strategy is to add reciprocal tariffs, which, guess what, hurts Canadians in the short term. So you have to ask yourself, is this something that you want to support? Is this something that you want to continue to move that way? Mark Carney, you'll see him campaigning in British Columbia over the next several days, which is actually turning out to be a key battleground province. We may actually have to wait to the end of the night on Monday to find out who our prime minister is. The polls, they have been tightening. Conservatives seem to be moving. I know in Atlantic Canada, what used to be a deep red for several of those provinces are now moving to a light red. There are several seats that are up for grabs. It's a little bit of a swing, so it really feels like it could go either way. Across the aggregate polls, we are still seeing the Liberals have a lead, but Conservatives are definitely closing in. It's going to be interesting to see how this goes out, because normally on election evening, we have a result typically when you have the polls closing in the east. So by the time polls are starting to close in Alberta, in BC, we already know the results and the predictions are usually in. This year, it might come down to British Columbia. When we're looking at the Conservatives, they are very strong throughout Alberta, Saskatchewan, even Manitoba. They've crept up a little bit in the last week. We've got the Liberals who are very strong in Ontario, as well as Quebec. Atlantic Canada, their strength has been weakening. And it's also going to be interesting to see what happens with BC, as it is a statistical tie. So that's going to be something that we are all going to have to watch for. Pierre Poilievre is continuing to focus on domestic issues, which is making Canada strong. Economic reform. He is of the mindset we cannot keep spending and doing what we have been doing. Although their platforms, they came out and the cost of platforms showed less spending, showed trying to reduce the deficit. The question I have, is it actually going to move the needle that much? I don't know if to be honest, to use these words, if it is extreme enough to get substantial change in Canada. If you're like me, you want to see Canada take a different direction. I want to see good policies and good ideas to bring strength back to Canadians, to our economy, to help build and invest in things that can grow. That is something we need to see. So the question is, are the Conservatives playing it too safe? Or is this enough to make people think I can trust them to actually help Canada? Interesting to look at the polls. When we look at the Nanos poll, recent Liberals are nationally around 42%, with the Conservatives closely behind 38%. I know there's been a lot made of the polls, saying what's happened with the Liberals and how they bounce up. We can't trust the polls. It makes no sense. I want you to listen to this for a second. What most Canadians aren't talking about is how much the NDP have dropped off, how much the Bloc has actually lost some ground in Quebec. When you have those two parties, the balance of power, the balance of votes shifts. When you have the NDP sub 10%, 6, 7% in some polls, those voters are going to move typically Liberal. Same thing with the Bloc in Quebec. When the Bloc isn't polling as well, those voters are typically going to move Liberal. It's not that the Conservatives have fallen off, but we have seen really the stories, the NDP and Jagmeet Singh and the Bloc, them losing ground. And where is that ground going? Well, polls have been showing it's been going to the Liberals. But is that enough to hold on to the lead? Conservatives are going to make a last-ditch effort over this weekend as they continue to campaign. But stick with us. We'll be back after the break with David Leis, president of the Frontier Centre of Public Policy. Well, welcome back to Merit TV Canada's election coverage. We are drawing closer and closer to the day of April 28th. I just want to remind you as you are watching this that on April 28th, we will be coming at you with live election coverage from 4 p.m. Mountain until the day is done. There's going to be many ways you can be a part of it, which will be a lot of fun. We will be joined that day by my good friend, David Leis, who is the president at the Frontier Centre for Public Policy. I'm also joined by him today. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
Excellent. Good to be here.
Good, good. Well, we are drawing close to Election Day. I know we just came off of the long weekend this past week where we had advanced polling. Over 7 million voters came out, which I believe is a record, which is a great start. Happy to see people being engaged with the voting process. But we are coming down to crunch time and these last couple days before the big day. Would love to hear your perspective, maybe from 10,000 feet, David. What are some of the key things that you are noticing, maybe some key issues or maybe key concerns that you have over the next couple of days that you'd like to see answered or you think are main storylines? What are some things you've been noticing the past couple of days?
Well, I'm really intrigued how the polls are tightening up. It seems to continue to be a horse race in many respects. The polls are a bit confusing. Some polls I believe, others I frankly don't. But
Yep.
I believe that that's typical. But I think what you have as well is a whole dynamic where you have highly committed voters in different camps, particularly in the conservative camp. So it'll be fascinating to see what the electoral turnout is like. That's ultimately the key date is the election day and how many
Yep.
people vote.
That is the ultimate poll. We're going to find out where people ultimately lie. And again, when you look at polls, I'm not in the camp at all of disregarding the polls or thinking that they're crooked or biased, like a lot of people have been intending. But you want to look at the aggregate polls. You want to look at, is there a trend that has been developing? Also, which one are the reliable ones that you can look at? Because I'm curious on your thoughts on this. Over the last couple of days, there have been some stories that have popped up from the Toronto Sun, I believe from Globe Politics as well, about citing that Pierre Poilievre is at risk of losing his own seat in his riding, yet despite some polls that show a 93% chance of him holding on to that. Interesting timing of those coming up. What are your thoughts on that? Is there truth to that? Is this a timely effort by certain media outlets to disregard the Conservatives? Love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I'm certainly very familiar with that writing. I think those are, frankly, headlines that are designed to, frankly, deceive voters, to demoralize people. I think it's an absurd proposition. I mean, you never say never. But I think those headlines actually strike to the heart of the legacy media, really all in on seeing the Liberal Party reelected. And why would that be? I mean, I think there's a lot of any thoughtful observer would say there's a lot of indicators to point to the fact that they have a vested interest in having their
That's right.
funding continue. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the big stories in this campaign. Certainly in my lifetime, I've never seen the legacy media so enthusiastic cheerleaders for one party. And I think that's wrong. I think you need a strong independent media. And I think that's why media credibility is so low in this country.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And that actually lends to the idea of what we're trying to do and trying to build. And there's a lot of great independents that have been rising up over the last several years. Obviously, distrust of mainstream media over the last, especially I think since the
Indeed.
convoy, when it really started to maximize across the country. But it is vital for a democracy to have a media that is functioning, that shares and advocates for all opinions. Like one in specific does not need to advocate for every outlet, but at least if we've got enough representation across the board, it helps citizens get what they need. I want to divert our attention to something that the Frontier Center for Public Policy has just released when it comes to oil and gas and potential money that we're leaving on the table or revenues for Canada. But just before that, David, Mark Carney has stated several times how he's trying to distinguish himself from Justin Trudeau is by having a focus on the economy. He's even used words by saying, I want to make us an energy superpower. Then he had an appearance last week on a French program where he actually talked about the energy superpower, meaning an energy transition process. He brought a bit more clarity to what that means because energy superpower, but at the same time, him being an advocate for net zero, Bill C-69, which is the No New Pipelines bill, they seem a little counterintuitive to become an energy superpower while restricting the very processes that we need to be able to get it out. Would love to hear your thoughts on what does Mark Carney mean by making us an energy superpower? What does that mean for oil and gas, Alberta, other parts of our country? And then let us know what you guys have been working on.
Well, I think the Liberal campaign is pretty clear. They want to see energy as a energy superpower to transition away from oil and gas, and that's always been the vision from the Liberal government the last 10 years. And so that war on oil and gas, and I use that word deliberately because there's dozens of important legislation that has been put in place to continue that war on oil and gas, whether it's Bill C-69, whether it's the so-called greenwashing bill where firms are not even able to talk about their environmental legacy for fear of penalty by law. I mean, the list goes on and on. So what's happened here is in the campaign, though, it's very clear that the campaign on the Liberal side has been very careful about being in the face of that issue. But I think those evidence of that policy continues on, and I think how Mr. Carney has responded to those questions regarding pipelines through Quebec is proof of that.
Okay. Well, it really is an issue. Actually, a quick question for you. Is Canada viable without our oil and gas going out and being more restrictive? Is that actually help Canada at all in terms of creating a robust economy, or are we dependent on that thriving?
You know, energy, dependable, reliable, affordable energy has always been the ace card, not only in Canada's economy, but in any other advanced economy. So if the war on oil and gas continues, I think it's obvious from an economic point of view that that continues to be problematic, especially when it's the largest industry in our country. It employs some 900,000 people, but it's more than that. It's foundational because every other industry, like a domino, is related to that energy formula, whether it's manufacturing, forestry, mining. I mean, the list goes on and on. So Canada is really built on energy, oil and gas to be precise. And so the whole idea that that war on energy continues is going to be disastrous for this country.
Well, there's a big argument to be made in favor of the net zero advocates that Canada Energy getting out to the world actually helps their cause because of how our processes compared to other countries who have next to no standards compared to what Canada's standards are for that. For me, this election, the number one issue personally for me is about economy. It's about changing the direction of building a robust, strong economy that we don't have to be reliant on other nations, that we can attract talent, we can attract investment into industries. It is about raising the standard of living continually in Canada, and how can we set ourselves on a new path? Because the metrics are there. We've not been on a great path for the last 10 years. You amplify that by another 10 years, I don't want to know where we're going to be at if we stay on the same path. Part of that is being able to maximize industries that we have, like oil and gas. Frontier Center for Public Policy, you guys just came out with an indicator that is showing essentially how much potential money that we are leaving on the table, meaning Alberta, Canada, we sell our oil and gas at discounted rates, and then that oil gets sold onto the market at full rates. So we are leaving some money on the table. Talk to us about the importance of what that is, but how we can track it through Frontier Center of Public Policy.
Right on. We've announced a special calculator that shows it's quite a sophisticated model developed under the leadership of our Vice President of Research and Policy, Dr. Marco Navarro-Gini. And this counter, you can see it on the website, shows minute by minute, hour by hour, the amount of money we are forfeiting because we don't get full world prices for oil and gas.
Yep.
And that amounts to about $30 billion. It's a dynamic number. It depends on the market, but we don't get
Is that annually,
full
David?
market
30
price.
billion annually?
That is annually.
Okay.
And these are horrendous numbers. They're really hard to imagine. But think of the numbers of hospitals, roads, the amount of things that we could do with that kind of money. But that has been by design. We've continued to be overly reliant on one customer, namely the United States. So it's the American refiners, ironically, and middlemen, if you will, that take Canadian oil and gas and basically resell it on the world market. And they make a killing with that profit that, in fact, Canada should be taking advantage. And why is this? Because we have failed as a country to incisively build those pipelines to Tidewater to get it to world markets when, in fact, England, Japan, Germany, Greece, all kinds of countries are demanding this
That's right.
energy. And
That's right.
we have high environmental standards. So this has been a deliberate policy for years now, and we've certainly talked about it at Frontier for a long, long time. We need to get our energy to market. In fact, that's not only about getting energy to the world, you can say it's improving our oil and gas are part of the environmental solution, because then you don't have to import it from places like, dictatorships like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and all the rest.
This is actually such a key point that probably doesn't get enough attention, because it actually works for both building the Canadian economy, getting our energy out to world markets, building infrastructure within Canada, which, guess what? It builds jobs. Even the idea of interprovincial trade from east to west, we have to use the U.S. corridors to get our oil and gas up into Eastern Canada. Eastern Canada imports, right? Oil tankers all the time across from Saudi and other spots.
You're right.
And there's an argument for bolstering the Canadian economy, but also, in theory, helping out the climate across the world, because when you look at major countries who are massively larger than what Canada is, especially when it comes to, if you want to use climate activist metrics, CO2 measurements and all that, Canada doesn't really move the needle on the world stage. Other countries do. But there's an argument to be made, if other countries receive our natural gas, our oil and gas, well, now you're diminishing the amount from other countries who have no standards. So the net gain is actually better for the environment, building the infrastructure for Canada. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the solution is not rocket scientist stuff. It's to build those pipelines now. If this is a national crisis, as so many parties indicate in this election, let's get on with building these pipelines. Let's commit to it in this election. And I think that's a question that voters need to ask. If you believe our standard of living is important, then we need to get on with building out every industry, including oil and gas. And for too long, there's been a war on that industry, and it's got to stop, in our opinion. And this counter, I think, was a way to help illustrate the incredible loss of money to this country. And it doesn't have to be this way. This is a reflection of not just incompetent policy from my perspective, but frankly, it's been by design. It's been intentional to stop oil and gas. And as a result, it's hurting Canadians. That means thousands of dollars for every Canadian. And it doesn't have to be.
So, Dave, we just got a minute left here. Last question for you. When you look at the Liberal platform, you look at the promises they've been making compared to the Conservative platform and the promises that they're making. And I'm not going to go into the other parties, because right now we're in a two-horse race for who's going to be a minority or a majority government here. Which party or leader, maybe it's both, maybe it's none, have the will to see the infrastructure built and want to make it? And then not just will, because it's easy to say and make promises, as we know, but what is the actual reality of being able to get this done? Does either party possess the will to say it, but also to get it done? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, frankly, I'm concerned about all the platforms that have been released. I think
Okay.
that it's like comparing, in my perspective, this is my opinion, a bad policy compared to one that is somewhat better. Because why is this? We need to anchor, I believe, any of these financial plans to reality. Deficits, debts matter. They the chickens will come home to roost. And you see this with some provinces. You see BC, others that have been downgraded in terms of their credit rating. Ultimately, the chickens come home to roost. These plans are not offering much hope when it comes to finding a balanced budget, to being able to move our country forward and to grow the economy seriously. And I think that um, the Liberal plan in particular isn't anchored to a key form of economics, which is what should be or what is the goal when it comes to the ratio between the size of the economy, the gross domestic product, and the deficit and the debt. Those are very important anchors that should anchor any plan. And why is that? Because money does not grow on trees. And I think this is a very important point that Canadians need to ask. How do you support that type of policy that ultimately our grandkids will still be paying off debt?
Do you think the Conservative platform offers some solutions, or is it a little just more of the same with some slight differences when it comes to the deficit economy spending?
I think it does offer some solutions. I think it's ambitious trying to move towards more of a private sector approach to growing the economy, which obviously our principles would say that's better public policy. I think it's also very much about trying to build Canada as a true energy superpower based on our strengths, namely oil and gas. And I think there's a lot of things there to acknowledge as wise decisions. But I think ultimately we need to realize that Canada is in rough shape and we're kind of in a trap. We need to build out our economy because in 2010, our differential in terms of average income with Canada and the United States was about 80%. And now it's heading towards about 65, 70%,
Hmm.
depending on which province.
Yeah.
And that gap is going to continue to get much, much worse.
Yeah, and even on that point, you can take into the drop that's happened of that 15% or so that you quoted, but also we got to take into account the opportunity cost of not growing, what you can do with the growth that potentially could have happened. David, we're out of time here, but honestly, I really appreciate your thoughts and your opinions. We'll be back right after this break. Stick with us. Thank you, David, for joining us from Frontier Center of Public Policy. Welcome back to Merit TV Canada's Election Watch. You know, Canada's 2025 federal election is entering its final days as we move towards this weekend, with voters going to be heading back to the polls on April 28th. Interesting to see all of the developments. I had a great chat with David Leis just a second ago regarding energy and regarding economy. I think those are very important points that we need to digest about how do we move our economy forward. Is Canadian energy worth getting out to world markets? Does it make the world better? Does it serve as an argument in promotion of hitting different targets that will help our climate if you want to go that direction? But we know for sure it does help the Canadian economy, and we've got higher standards than a lot of countries in the world in how we produce it. That's something that you have to look at, conservatives or liberals, as to who answers that question better, because that can have a massive impact. As we see Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre continue to campaign over the weekend, there's going to be a lot of focus in BC as they're at a statistical tie. That may come down to the key battleground province to decide who is going to be the Prime Minister of Canada going forward. Stick with us here at Merit TV Canada Election Watch as we continue to provide you with the latest information. Thanks for hanging with us tonight. Have a good evening.